Section 1 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Moscato. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 1, Chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1. I remained for some time in the Cardinal of Ferrara's palace, very well regarded in general by everybody, and much more visited even than I had previously been. Everybody was astonished that I should have come out of prison, and have been able to live through such indescribable afflictions; and while I was recovering my breath and endeavouring to resume the habit of my art, I had great pleasure in rewriting the Capitolo. Afterwards, with a view to re-establishing my strength, I determined to take a journey of a few days for change of air. My good friend the Cardinal gave me permission and lent me horses, and I had two young Romans for my companions, one of them a craftsman in my trade, the other only a comrade in our journey. We left Rome, and took the road to Tagliacozzo, intending to visit my pupil Ascanio, who lived there. On our arrival I found the lad, together with his father, brothers, sisters, and stepmother. I was entertained by them 2 days with indescribable kindness; then I turned my face towards Rome, taking Ascanio with me. On the road we fell to conversing about our art, which made me die of impatience to get back and recommence my labours. Having reached Rome, I got myself at once in readiness to work, and was fortunate enough to find again a silver basin which I had begun for the Cardinal before I was imprisoned. Together with this basin I had begun a very beautiful little jug, but this had been stolen, with a great quantity of other valuable articles. I set Pagolo, whom I have previously mentioned, to work upon the basin. At the same time I recommenced the jug, which was designed with round figures and bas reliefs. The basin was executed in a similar style, with round figures and fishes in bas relief. The whole had such richness and good keeping that everyone who beheld it expressed astonishment at the force of the design and the beauty of invention, and also at the delicacy with which these young men worked. The Cardinal came at least twice a day to see me, bringing with him Messer Luigi Alamanni and Messer Gabriele Cesano, and here we used to pass an hour or two pleasantly together. Notwithstanding I had very much to do, he kept giving me fresh commissions. Among others, I had to make his pontifical seal of the size of the hand of a boy of 12. On it I engraved in intaglio 2 little histories, the one of San Giovanni preaching in the wilderness, the other of Sant Ambrogio expelling the Arians, on horseback with a lash in his hand. The fire and correctness of design of this piece, and its nicety of workmanship, made everyone say that I had surpassed the great Lautazio, who ranked alone in this branch of the profession. The Cardinal was so proud of it that he used to compare it complacently with the other seals of the Roman cardinals, which were nearly all from the hand of Lautizio. Chapter 2. In addition to these things, the Cardinal ordered me to make the model for a salt cellar, but he said he should like me to leave the beaten track pursued by such as fabricated these things. Messer Luigi, a propos of this salt cellar, made an eloquent description of his own idea. Messer Gabriele Cesano also spoke exceedingly well to the same purpose. The Cardinal, who was a very kindly listener, showed extreme satisfaction with the designs which these 2 able men of letters had described in words. Then he turned to me and said, "My Benvenuto, the design of Messer Luigi and that of Messer Gabriele please me both so well that I know not how to choose between them. Therefore I leave the choice to you, who will have to execute the work." I replied as follows: "It is apparent, my lords, of what vast consequence are the sons of kings and emperors, and what a marvellous brightness of divinity appears in them. Nevertheless, if you ask some poor humble shepherd which he loves best, those royal children or his sons, he he will certainly tell you that he loves his own sons best. Now I too have a great affection for the children which I bring forth from my art. Consequently, the first which I will show you, most reverend Monsignor, my good master, shall be of my own making and invention. There are many things beautiful enough in words, which do not match together well when executed by an artist." Then I turned to the two scholars and said, "You have spoken, I will do." Upon this, Messer Luigi Alamanni smiled, and added a great many witty things, with the greatest charm of manner, in my praise. They became him well, for he was handsome of face and figure, and had a gentle voice. Messer Gabriello Cesano was quite the opposite, as ugly and displeasing as the other was agreeable. Accordingly, he spoke as he looked. Messer Luigi had suggested that I should fashion a Venus with Cupid surrounded by a crowd of pretty emblems, all in proper keeping with the subject. Messer Gabriello proposed that I should model an Amphitrite, the wife of Neptune, together with those Tritons of the sea, and many such like fancies, good enough to describe in words, but not to execute in metal. I first laid down an oval framework, considerably longer than half a cubit, almost 2/3 in fact, and upon this ground, wishing to suggest the interminglement of land and ocean, I modelled two figures considerably taller than a palm in height, which were seated with their legs interlaced, suggesting those lengthier branches of the sea which run up into the continents. The sea was a man, and in his hand I placed a ship, elaborately wrought in all its details, and well adapted to hold a quantity of salt. Beneath him I grouped the 4 sea horses, and in his right hand he held his trident. The earth I fashioned like a woman, with all the beauty of form, the grace and charm of which my art was capable. She had a richly decorated temple firmly based upon the ground at one side, and here her hand rested. This I intended to receive the pepper. In her other hand I put a cornucopia overflowing with all the natural treasures I could think of. Below this goddess, in the part which represented earth, I collected the fairest animals that haunt our globe. In the quarter presided over by the deity of ocean, I fashioned such choice kinds of fishes and shells as could be properly displayed in that small space. What remained of the oval I filled in with luxuriant ornamentation. Then I waited for the Cardinal, and when he came, attended by the 2 accomplished gentlemen, I produced the model I had made in wax. On beholding it, Messer Gabriello Cesano was the first to lift his voice up and to cry, "This is a piece which it will take the lives of 10 men to finish. Do not expect, most reverend Monsignor, if you order it, to get it in your lifetime. Benvenuto, it seems, has chosen to display his children in a vision, but not to give them to the touch, as we did when we spoke of things that could be carried out, while he has shown a thing beyond the bounds of possibility." Messer Alamanni took my side, but the Cardinal said he did not care to undertake so important an affair. Then I turned to them and said, "Most reverend Monsignor, and you, gentlemen, fulfilled with learning, I tell you that I hope to complete this piece for whosoever shall be destined to possess it, and each one of you shall live to see it executed 100 times more richly than the model. Indeed, I hope that time will be left me to produce far greater things than this." The Cardinal replied in heat, "Unless you make it for the king to whom I mean to take you, I do not think that you will make it for another man alive." Then he showed me letters in which the king, under one heading, bade him return as soon as possible, bringing Benvenuto with him. At this I raised my hands to heaven, exclaiming, "Oh, when will that moment come, and quickly?" The Cardinal bade me put myself in readiness, and arrange the affairs I had in Rome. He gave me 10 days for these preparations. Chapter 3. When the time came to travel, he gave me a fine and excellent horse. The animal was called Tornon, because it was a gift from the Cardinal Tornon. My apprentices, Pagolo and Ascanio, were also furnished with good mounts. The Cardinal divided his household, which was very numerous, into 2 sections. The first, and the more distinguished, he took with him, following the route of Romagna, with the object of visiting Madonna del Loreto, and then making for Ferrara, his own home. The other section he sent upon the road to Florence. This was the larger train. It counted a great multitude, including a flower of his horse. He told me that if I wished to make the journey without peril, I had better go with him, otherwise I ran some risk of my life. I expressed my inclination to his most reverend lordship to travel in his suite. But having done so, since the will of Heaven must be accomplished, it pleased God to remind me of my poor sister, who had suffered greatly from the news of my misfortunes. I also remembered my cousins, who were nuns in Viterbo, the one abbess and the other camerlinga, and who had therefore that rich convent under their control. They too had endured sore tribulation for my sake, and to their fervent prayers I firmly believed that I owed the grace of my deliverance by God. Accordingly, when these things came into my mind, I decided for the route to Florence. I might have travelled free of expense with the Cardinal or with that other train of his, but I chose to take my own way by myself. Eventually I joined company with a very famous clockmaker called Maestro Cherubino, my esteemed friend. Thrown together by accident, we performed the journey with much enjoyment on both sides. I had left Rome on Monday in Passion Week, together with Pagolo and Ascanio. At Monte Rossi we joined the company which I have mentioned. Since I had expressed my intention of following the Cardinal, I did not anticipate that any of my enemies would be upon the watch to harm me. Yet I ran a narrow risk of coming to grief at Monte Rossi, for a band of men had been sent forward, well armed, to do me mischief there. It was so ordained by God that while we were at dinner, these fellows, on the news that I was not travelling in the Cardinal's suite, made preparation to attack me. Just at that moment the Cardinal's retinue arrived, and I was glad enough to travel with their escort safely to Viterbo. From that place onward I had no apprehension of danger, especially as I made a point of travelling a few miles in front, and the best men of the retinue kept a good watch over me. I arrived by God's grace safe and sound at Viterbo, where my cousins and all the convent received me with the greatest kindness. Chapter 4. I bought a new pair of stirrups, although I still hoped to regain my good pad by persuasion; and since I was very well mounted, and well armed with shirt and sleeves of mail, and carried an excellent arquebus upon my saddle bow, I was not afraid of the brutality and violence which that mad beast was said to be possessed of. I had also accustomed my young men to carry shirts of mail, and had great confidence in the Roman, who, while we were in Rome together, had never left it off, so far as I could see. Ascanio, too, although he was but a stripling, was in the habit of wearing one. Besides, as it was Good Friday, I imagined that the madnesses of madmen might be giving themselves a holiday. When we came to the Camollia gate, I at once recognized the postmaster by the indications given me, for he was blind of the left eye. Riding up to him then, and leaving my young men and companions at a little distance, I courteously addressed him: "Master of the post, if I assure you that I did not override your horse, why are you unwilling to give me back my pad and stirrups?" The reply he made was precisely as mad and brutal as had been foretold me. This roused me to exclaim: "How then? Are you not a Christian? Or do you not want upon Good Friday to force us both into a scandal?" He answered that Good Friday or the Devil's Friday was all the same to him, and that if I did not take myself away he would fell me to the ground with a spontoon which he had taken up. Me and the arquebus I had my hand on. Upon hearing these truculent words, an old gentleman of Siena joined us. He was dressed like a citizen, and was returning from the religious functions proper to that day. It seemed that he had gathered the sense of my arguments before he came up to where we stood, and this impelled him to rebuke the postmaster with warmth, taking my side, and reprimanding the man's two sons for not doing their duty to passing strangers, so that their manners were an offence to God and a disgrace to the city of Siena. The two young fellows wagged their heads without saying a word, and withdrew inside the house. Their father, stung to fury by the scolding of that respectable gentleman, poured out a volley of abusive blasphemies, and levelled his spontoon, swearing he would murder me. When I saw him determined to do some act of bestial violence, I pointed the muzzle of my arquebus, with the object only of keeping him at a distance. Doubly enraged by this, he flung himself upon me. Though I had prepared the arquebus for my defence, I had not yet levelled it exactly at him. Indeed, it was pointed too high. It went off of itself, and the ball, striking the arch of the door and glancing backwards, wounded him in the throat, so that he fell dead to earth. Upon this, the two young men came running out. One caught up a partisan from the rack which stood there, the other seized the spontoon of his father. Springing upon my followers, the one who had the spontoon smote Pagolo the Roman first above the left nipple. The other attacked a Milanese who was in our company, and had the ways and manners of a perfect fool. This man screamed out that he had nothing in the world to do with me, and parried the point of the partisan with a little stick he held. But this availed him naught. In spite of his words and fencing, he received a flesh wound in the mouth. Messer Cherubino wore the habit of a priest, for though he was a clockmaker by trade, he held benefices of some value from the Pope. Ascanio, who was well armed, stood his ground without trying to escape, as the Milanese had done, so these two came off unhurt. I had set spurs to my horse, and while he was galloping had charged and got my arquebus in readiness again, but now I turned back, burning with fury, and meaning to play my part this time in earnest. I thought that my young men had been killed, and was resolved to die with them. The horse had not gone many paces when I met them riding toward me, and asked if they were hurt. Ascanio answered that Pagolo was wounded to the death. Then I said, "O Pagolo, my son, did the spontoon then pierce through your armour?" "No," he replied, "for I put my shirt of mail in the valet this morning." "So then, I suppose, one wears chain mail in Rome to swagger before ladies, but where there is danger, and one wants it, one keeps it locked up in a portmanteau? You deserve what you have got, and you are now the cause of sending me back to die here too." While I was uttering these words I kept riding briskly onward, but both the young men implored me for the love of God to save myself and them, and not to rush on certain death. Just then I met Messer Cherubino and the wounded Milanese. The former cried out that no one was badly wounded. The blow given to Pagolo had only grazed the skin, but the old postmaster was stretched out dead. His sons with other folk were getting ready for attack, and we must almost certainly be cut to pieces. Accordingly, Benvenuto, since fortune has saved us from this first tempest, do not tempt her again, for things may not go so favourably a second time." To this I replied, "If you are satisfied to have it thus, so also am I." And turning to Pagolo and Ascanio, I said, "Strike spurs to your horses, and let us gallop to Staggia without stopping. There we shall be in safety." The wounded Milanese groaned out, "A pox upon our peccadilloes! The sole cause of my misfortune was that I sinned by taking a little broth this morning, having nothing else to break my fast with." In spite of the great peril we were in, we could not help laughing a little at the donkey and his silly speeches. Then we set spurs to our horses, and left Messer Cherubino and the Milanese to follow at their leisure. Section 1. Recording by Pam Moscato.
Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. Section 2, Chapters 5 through 9. Chapter 5. While we were making our escape, the sons of the dead man ran to the Duke of Melfi, and begged for some light horsemen to catch us up and take us prisoners. The Duke, upon being informed that we were the Cardinal of Ferrara's men, refused to give them troops or leave to follow. We meanwhile arrived at Staggia, where we were in safety. There we sent for a doctor, the best who could be had in such place, and on his examining Pagolo, we discovered that the wound was only skin deep. So I felt sure that he would escape without mischief. Then he ordered dinner, and at this juncture there arrived Messer Cherubino, Milanese simpleton, who kept always muttering, "A plague upon your quarrels," and complaining that he was excommunicated because he had not been able to say a single paternoster on that holy morning. He was very ugly, and his mouth, which nature had been large, and been expanded at least 3 inches by his wound, so that with his ludicrous Milanese jargon and silly way of talking, he gave us so much matter for mirth, that instead of bemoaning our ill luck, we could not hold from laughing at every word he uttered. When the doctor wanted to sew up his wound, and had always made 3 stitches with his needle, the fellow told him to hold hard a while, since he did not want him out of malice to sew the whole mouth up. Then he took up a spoon, and said he wished to have his mouth left open enough to take that spoon in order that he might return alive to his own folk. These things he said with such odd waggings of the head, that we never stopped from laughing, and so pursued our journey mirthfully to Florence. We dismounted at the house of my poor sister, who, together with her husband, overwhelmed us with kind attentions. Messer Cherubino and the Milanese went about their business. In Florence we remained 4 days, during which Pagolo got well. It was lucky for us that whenever we talked about that Milanese donkey, we laughed as much as our misfortunes made us weep, so that we kept laughing and crying both at the same moment. Pagolo recovered, as I have said, with ease, and then we travelled toward Ferrara, where we found our lord the cardinal had not yet arrived. He had already heard of all our accidents, and said, when he expressed his concern for them, "I pray to God that I may be allowed to bring you alive to the king." According to my promise, in Ferrara he sent me to reside at a palace of his, a very handsome place called Belfiore, close under the city walls. There he provided me with all things necessary for my work. A little later he arranged to leave for France without me, and observing that I was very ill pleased with this, he said to me, "Benvenuto, I am acting for your welfare. Before I take you out of Italy, I want you to know exactly what you will have to do when you come to France. Meanwhile, push on my basin and the jug with all the speed you can. I shall leave orders with my factor to give you everything that you may want." He then departed, and I remained sorely dissatisfied, and more than once I was upon the point of taking myself off without license. The only thing which kept me back was that he had procured my freedom from Pope Paolo. For the rest, I was ill contented, and put to considerable losses. However, I clothed my mind with the gratitude due to that great benefit, and disposed myself to be patient, and to await the termination of the business. So I set myself to work with my 2 men, and made great progress with the jug and basin. The air was unwholesome where we lodged, and towards summer we all of us suffered somewhat in our health. During our indisposition we went about inspecting the domain. It was haunted too by multitudes of peacocks, which bred and nested there like wildfowl. This put it into my head to charge my gun with a noiseless kind of powder. Then I tracked some of the young birds, and every other day killed one, which furnished us with abundance of meat of such excellent quality that we shook our sickness off. For several months following we went on working merrily, and got the jug and basin forward, but it was a task that required much time. Chapter 6. At that period the Duke of Ferrara came to the terms with Pope Paul about some old matters in dispute between them relating to Modena and certain other cities. The Church having a strong claim to them, the Duke was forced to purchase peace by paying down an enormous sum of money. I think that it exceeded 300,000 ducats of the Camera. There was an old treasurer in the service of the Duke, who had been brought up by his father, Duke Alfonso, and was called Messer Girolamo Giuliolo. He could not endure to see so much money going to the Pope, and went about the streets crying, Duke Alfonso, his father, would sooner have attacked and taken Rome with his money than have shown it to the Pope. Nothing would induce him to disburse it. At last, however, the Duke compelled him to make the payments, which caused the old man such anguish that he sickened of a dangerous colic, and was brought to death's door. During this man's illness the Duke sent for me, and bade me take his portrait. This I did upon a circular piece of black stone, about the size of a little trencher. The Duke took so much pleasure in my work and conversation that he not unfrequently posed through 4 or 5 hours at a stretch for his own portrait, and sometimes invited me to supper. It took me 8 days to complete his likeness. Then he ordered me to design the reverse. On it I modelled peace, giving her the form of a woman with a torch in her hand, setting fire to a trophy of arms. I portrayed her in an attitude of gladness, with very thin drapery, and below her feet lay Fury in despair, downcast and sad, loaded with chains. I devoted much study and attention to his work, and it won me the greatest honour. The Duke was never tired of expressing his satisfaction, and gave me inscriptions for both sides of the medal. That on the reverse ran as follows: Pretiosa in conspecto Domini. It meant that his peace with the Pope had been dearly bought. Chapter 7. While I was still engaged upon the reverse of this medal, the Cardinal sent me letters bidding me prepare for my journey, since the King had asked after me. His next communication would contain full details respecting all that he had promised. Accordingly, I had my jug and basin packed up. After showing them to the Duke, now a Ferrarese gentleman, named Alberto Bendedio, was the Cardinal's agent, and he had been 12 years confined to his house, without once leaving it, by reason of some physical infirmity. One day he sent in a vast hurry for me, saying I must take the post at once, in order to present myself before the King of France, who had eagerly been asking for me. Under the impression that I was in France, by way of apology, the Cardinal told him that I was staying, slightly indisposed, in his abbey at Lyons, but that he would have me brought immediately to his Majesty. Therefore I must lose no time, but travel with the post. Now Messer Alberto was a man of sterling worth, but proud, and illness made his haughty temper insupportable. As I have just said, he bade me to get ready on the spot, and take the journey by the common post. I said that it was not the custom to pursue my profession in the post, and that if I had to go, it was my intention to make easy stages, and to take with me the workmen Ascanio and Pagolo, whom I had brought from Rome. Moreover, I wanted a servant on horseback, to be at my orders, and money sufficient for my cost upon the way. The infirm old man replied, upon a tone of mighty haughtiness, and the sons of dukes were wont to travel as I had described, and in no other fashion. I retorted that the sons of my art travelled in the way I had informed them, and that not being a duke's son, I knew nothing about the customs of such folk, if he treated me to language with which my ears were unfamiliar. I would not go at all, the Cardinal having broken faith in me, and such scurvy words having been spoken. I should make my mind up, once for all, to take no further trouble with the Ferrarese. Then I turned my back, and he threatening, I grumbling, took my leave. I next went to the Duke with my medal, which was finished. He received me with the highest marks of honour and esteem. It seems that he had given orders to Messer Girolamo Giliolo to reward me for my labour with a diamond ring worth 200 crowns, which was to be presented by Fiaschino, his chamberlain. Accordingly, his fellow, on the evening after I had brought the medal, at 1 hour past nightfall, handed me a ring with the diamond, of showy appearance, and spoke as follows on the part of his master: "Take this diamond as a remembrance of his Excellency, to adorn the unique artist's hand, which has produced a masterpiece of so singular merit." When day broke, I examined the ring, and found the stone to be a miserable thin diamond, worth about 10 crowns. I felt sure that the Duke had not meant to accompany such magnificent compliments with so trifling a gift, but that he must have intended to reward me handsomely. Being then convinced that the trick proceeded from his rogue of his treasurer, I gave the ring to a friend of mine, begging him to return it to the chamberlain, Fiaschino, as he best could. The man I chose was Bernardo Saliti, who executed his commission admirably. Fiaschino came at once to see me, and declared with vehement expostulations that the Duke would take it very ill if I refused a present he had meant so kindly. Perhaps I should have to repent of my waywardness. I answered that the ring his Excellency had given me his worth about 10 crowns, and that the work I had done for him was worth more than 200. Wishing, however, to show his Excellency how highly I esteemed his courtesy, I should be happy if he bestowed on me only one of those rings for the cramp, which come from England, and we are worth 10d. I would treasure that so long as I lived in remembrance of his Excellency, together with the honourable message he had sent me, for I considered that the splendid favours of his Excellency had amply recompensed my pains, whereas that paltry stone insulted them. This speech annoyed the Duke so much that he sent for his treasurer, and scolded him more sharply than he had ever done before. At the same time he gave me orders, under pain of his displeasure, not to leave Ferrara without duly informing him, and commanded the treasurer to present me with a diamond up to 300 crowns in value. The miserly official found a stone rising, a trifle above 60 crowns, and let it be heard that it was worth upwards of 200. Chapter 8. Meanwhile Messer Alberto returned to reason, and provided me with all I had demanded. My mind was made up to quit Ferrara without fail that very day, but the Duke's attentive chamberlain arranged with Messer Alberto that I should get no horses then. I had loaded a mule with my baggage, including the case which held the Cardinal's jug and basin. Just then a Ferrarese nobleman named Messer Alfonso di Torotti arrived. He was far advanced in years, and a person of excessive affectation, a great dilettante of the arts, but one of those men who are very difficult to satisfy, and who, if they chance to stumble on something which suits their taste, exalt it so their own fancy that they never expect to see the like of it again. Well, this Messer Alfonso arrived, and Messer Alberto said to him, "I am sorry that you are come so late. The jug and basin we are sending to the Cardinal in France have been already packed." He answered that it did not signify to him, and beckoning to his servant, sent him home to fetch a jug in white fanes o' clay, the workmanship of which was very exquisite. During the time the servant took to go and return, Messer Alfonso said to Messer Alberto, "I will tell you why I do not care any longer to look at vases. It is that I once beheld a piece of silver, antique, of such beauty and such finish that the human imagination cannot possibly conceive its rarity. Therefore I would rather not inspect any objects of the kind, for fear of spoiling the unique impression I retain of that. I must tell you that a gentleman of great quality and accomplishments, who went to Rome upon matters of business, had this antique vase shown to him in secret. By adroitly using a large sum of money, he bribed the person in whose hands it was, and brought it with him to these parts, but he keeps it jealously from all eyes, in order that the Duke may not get wind of it, fearing he should in some way be deprived of his treasure. While spinning out this lengthy yarn, Messer Alfonso did not look at me, because we were not previously acquainted. But when that precious clay model appeared, he displayed it with such airs of ostentation, pomp, and mountebank ceremony, that after inspecting it, I turned to Messer Alberto and said, "I am indeed lucky to have had the privilege to see it." Messer Alfonso, quite affronted, let some contemptuous words escape him, and exclaimed, "Who are you, then, you who do not know what you are saying?" I replied, "Listen for a moment, and afterwards judge which of us knows best what he is saying." Then turning to Messer Alberto, who was a man of great gravity and talent, I began, "This is a copy from a little silver goblet of such and such weight, which I made at such and such a time for that charlatan Maestro Jacopo, the surgeon from Carpi. He came to Rome and spent 6 months there, during which he had bedaubed some scores of noblemen and unfortunate gentlefolk with his dirty salves, extracting many thousands of ducats from their pockets. At that time I made for him this face and one of a different pattern. He paid me very badly, and at the present moment in Rome all the miserable people who use his ointment are crippled, and in a deplorable state of health. It is indeed great glory for me that my works are held in such a repute among you wealthy lords, but I can assure you that during these many years past I have been progressing in my art with all my might, and I think that the vase I am taking with me into France is far more worthy of cardinals and kings than that piece belonging to your little quack doctor." After I had made this speech, Messer Alfonso seemed dying with desire to see the judge and basin, but I refused to open the box. We remained some while disputing the matter, when he said that he would go to the Duke and get an order from his Excellency to have it shown him. Then Messer Alberto Bendedio, in the high and mighty manner which belonged to him, exclaimed, "Before you leave this room, Messer Alfonso, you shall see it, without employing the Duke's influence." On hearing these words I took my leave, and left Ascanio and Pagolo to show it. They told me afterwards that he had spoken enthusiastically in my praise. After this he wanted to become better acquainted with me, but I was wearying to leave Ferrara and get away from all its folk. The only advantages I had enjoyed there were the society of Cardinal Salviati and the Cardinal Ravina, and the friendship of some ingenious musicians. No one else been to me of any good, for the Ferrarese are a very avaricious people, greedy of their neighbours' money, however they may lay their hands on it. They are all the same in this respect. At the hour of 22, Fiaschino arrived, and gave me the diamond of 60 crowns, of which I spoke above. He told me, with a hang-dog look and a few brief words, that I might wear it for his Excellency's sake. I replied, "I will do so." Then putting my foot in the stirrup in his presence, I set off upon my travels without further leave taking. The man noted down my act and words, and reported them to the Duke, who was highly incensed, and showed a strong inclination to make me retrace my steps. Chapter 9. That evening I rode more than 10 miles, always at a trot, and when, upon the next day, I found myself outside Ferrarese domain, I felt excessively relieved. Indeed, I had met with nothing to my liking there, except those peacocks, which restored my health. We journeyed by the Monnies, avoiding the city of Milion on account of the apprehension I have spoken of, so that we arrived safe and sound at Lyons, counting Pagolo and Ascanio and a servant. We were 4 men, with 4 very good horses. At Lyons we waited several days for the muleteer, who carried the silver cup and basin, as well as our other baggage. Our lodging was in an abbey of the Cardinal's. When the muleteer arrived, we loaded all our goods upon a little cart, and then set off toward Paris. On the road we met with some annoyances, but not of any great moment. We found on the court of the king at Fontana Bellio. There we presented ourselves to the Cardinal, who provided us at once with lodgings, and that evening we were comfortable. On the following day the cart turned up, so we unpacked our things, and when the Cardinal heard this he told the king, who expressed a wish to see me at once. I went to his Majesty with a cup and basin. Then, upon entering his presence, I kissed his knee, and he received me very graciously. I thanked his Majesty for freeing me with prison, saying that all princes unique for generosity upon the earth, as was his Majesty, lay under especial obligations to set free men of talent, and particularly those that were innocent. As I was, such benefits, I added, were inscribed upon the book of God before any other good actions. The king, while I was delivering this speech, continued listening till the end, with the utmost courtesy, dropping a few words, such as only he could utter. Then he took the vase and basin, and exclaimed, Of a truth, I hardly think the ancients can have seen a piece so beautiful as this. I well remember to have inspected all the best works, and by the greatest masters of all Italy, but I never set my eyes on anything which stirred me to such admiration." These words the king addressed in French to the Cardinal of Ferrara, with many others to even warmer praise. Then he turned to me and said in Italian, "Benvenuto, amuse yourself for a few days. Make good cheer and spend your time in pleasure. In the meanwhile, we will think of giving you the wherewithal to execute some fine works of art for us." End of section 2. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini Part 2, Section 3, Chapters 10 through 13. Chapter 10. The Cardinal of Ferrara saw that the king had been vastly pleased by my arrival. He also judged that the trifles which I showed him of my handicraft, and had encouraged him to hope for the execution of considerable things he had in mind. At this time, however, we were following the court with the weariest trouble and fatigue. The reason of this was that the train of the king dragged itself along with never less than 12,000 horse behind it. This calculation is very lowest, for when the court is complete in times of peace, there are some 18,000, which makes 12,000 less than the average. Consequently, we had to journey after it through places where sometimes there were scarcely 2 houses to be found, and then we set up canvas tents like gypsies, and suffered at times very great discomfort. I therefore kept urging the cardinal to put the king in mind of employing me in some locality where I could stop and work. The cardinal answered that it was far better to wait until the king should think of it himself, and that I ought to show myself at times to his majesty while he was at table. This I did then, and one morning at his dinner the king called me. He began to talk to me in Italian, saying he would had it in his mind to execute several great works, and that he would soon give orders where I was to labor, and provide me with all necessaries. These communications he mingled with discourse on divers pleasant matters. The Cardinal of Ferrara was there, because he almost always ate in the morning at the king's table. He had heard our conversation, and when the king rose, he spoke in my favor to this purport: "As I afterwards was informed, Sacred Majesty, this Benvenuto is very eager to get to work again. It seems almost a sin to let an artist of his abilities waste his time." The king replied that he had spoken well, and told him to arrange with me all the things for my support according to my wishes. Upon the evening of the day when he received this commission, the cardinal sent for me after supper, and told me that his majesty was resolved to let me begin working, but that he wanted me first to come to an understanding about my appointments. To this the cardinal added, "It seems to me that if his majesty allows you 300 crowns a year, you will be able to keep yourself very well indeed. Furthermore, I advise you to leave yourself in my hands, for every day offers the opportunity of doing some service in this great kingdom, and I shall exert myself with vigor in your interest." Then I began to speak as follows: "When your most reverend lordship left me in Ferrara, you gave me a promise, which I had never asked for, not to bring me out of Italy before I clearly understood the terms on which I should be placed here with his majesty. Instead of sending to communicate these details, your most reverend lordship urgently ordered me to come by the post, as if an art like mine was carried on post haste. Had you written to tell me of 300 crowns, as you have now spoken, I would not have stirred a foot for twice that sum. Nevertheless, I thank God and your most reverend lordship for all things, seeing God has employed you as the instrument for my great God in procuring my liberation from imprisonment. Therefore I assure your lordship that all the troubles you are now causing me fall 1,000 times short of the great God which you have done me. With all my heart I thank you, and take good leave of you, wherever I may be, so long as I have life. I will pray God for you." The cardinal was greatly irritated, and cried out in a rage, "Go where you choose. It is impossible to help people against their will." Some of his good-for-nothing courtiers who were present said, "That fellow gets great store on himself, for he is refusing 300 ducats a year." Another, who was a man of talent, replied, "The king will never find his equal, and our cardinal wants to cheapen him, as though we were a load of wood." This was Messer Luigi Alamanni, who spoke to the above effect. As I was afterwards informed, all this happened on the last day of October, in Dauphine, at a castle, the name of which I do not remember. Chapter 11. On leaving the cardinal, I repaired to my lodging, which was 3 miles distant, in company with the secretary of the cardinal returning to the same quarters. On the road, this man never stopped asking me what I meant to do with myself, and what my own terms regarding the appointment would have been. I gave him only one word back for answer, which was that I knew all. When we came to our quarters, I found Pagolo and Ascanio there, and seeing me too much troubled, they implored me to tell them what was the matter. To the poor young men, who were all dismayed, I said for answer, "Tomorrow I shall give you money ample sufficient for your journey home. I mean myself to go out a most important business without you, which for a long time I have had it in my mind to do." Our room adjoined that of the secretary, and I think it not improbable that he wrote to the cardinal and informed him of my purpose. However, I never knew anything for certain about this. The night passed without sleep, and I kept wearying for the day, in order to carry out my resolution. No sooner did it dawn than I ordered out the horses, made my preparations in a moment, and gave the 2 young men everything which I had brought with me, and 50 ducats of gold in addition. I reserved the same sum for myself, together with the diamond the Duke had given me. I only kept 2 shirts and some well-worn riding clothes, which I had upon my back. I found it almost impossible to get free of the 2 young men, who insisted upon going with me. Whatever happened, at last I was obliged to treat them with contempt, and use this language: "One of you has his first beard, and the other is just getting it, and both of you have learned as much as from me I could teach in my poor art, so that you are now the first craftsmen among the youths of Italy. Are you not ashamed to have no courage to quit this go-cart, but must always creep about in leading strings? The thing is too disgraceful. Or if I were to send you away without money, what would you say then? Come, take yourselves out of my sight, and may God bless you 1,000 times. Farewell." I turned my horse and left them weeping. Then I took my way along a very fair road through a forest, hoping to make at least 40 miles that day, and reach the most out-of-the-way place I could. I had already ridden about 2 miles, and during that short time had resolved never to revisit any of those parts where I was known. I also determined to abandon my art so soon, as I had made Christ 3 cubits in height, reproducing, so far as I was able, that infinite beauty which he had himself revealed to me. So then, being thoroughly resolved, I turned my face toward the holy sepulchre. Just when I thought I had got so far that nobody could find me, I heard horses galloping after. They filled me with some uneasiness, because that district is infested with a race of brigands, who bear the name of venturers, and are apt to murder men upon the road. Though numbers of them are hanged every day, it seems as though they did not care. However, when the riders approached, I found they were a messenger from the king and my lad Ascanio. The former came up to me and said, "From the king I order you to come immediately to his presence." I replied, "You have been sent by the cardinal, and for this reason I will not come." The man said that, since gentle usage would not bring me, he had authority to raise the folk, and they would take me, bound hand and foot like a prisoner. Ascanio, for his part, did all he could to persuade me, reminding me that when the king sent a man to prison, he kept him there 5 years at least before he let him out again. This word about the prison, when I remembered what I had endured in Rome, struck such terror into me that I wheeled my horse round briskly, and followed the king's messenger. He kept perpetually chattering in French through all our journey up to the very precincts of the court. at one time bowling, now saying one thing, then another, till I felt inclined to deny God and the world. Chapter 12. On our way to the lodgings, if the king we passed before those of the Cardinal of Ferrara. Standing at his door, he called to me and said, "Our most Christian monarch has of his own accord assigned you the same appointments which his Majesty allowed the painter Leonardo da Vinci, that is, a salary of 700 crowns. In addition, he will pay you for all the works you do for him. Also for your journey hither he gives you 500 golden crowns, which will be paid you before you quit this place." At the end of this announcement, I replied that those were offers worthy of the great king he was. The messenger, not knowing anything about me, and hearing what splendid offers had been made me by the king, begged my pardon over and over again. Pagolo and Ascanio exclaimed, "It is God who had helped us to get back into so honored a go-cart." On the day following, I went to thank the king, who ordered me to take the models of 12 silver statues, which were to stand as candelabra round his table. He wanted them to represent 6 gods and 6 goddesses, and to have exactly the same height as his Majesty, which was a trifle under 4 cubits. Having dictated this commission, he returned to his treasurer, and asked whether he had paid me the 500 crowns. The official said that he had received no orders to that effect. The king took this very ill, for he had requested the cardinal to speak to him about it. Furthermore, he had told me to go to Paris and seek out a place to live in, fitted in the execution of such work. He could see that I obtained it. I got the 500 crowns of gold, and took up my quarters at Paris in a house of the Cardinal of Ferrara, where I began, in God's name, to work, and fashion 4 little waxen models, about 2/3 of a cubit each in height. They were Jupiter, Juno, Apollo, and Vulcan. In this, while the king returned to Paris, whereupon I went to him at once, taking my models with me, and my 2 apprentices, Ascanio and Pagolo. On perceiving that the king was pleased with my work, and being commissioned to execute the Jupiter in silver of the height above described, I introduced the 2 young men, and said that I had brought them with me out of Italy to serve his Majesty. For insomuch as they had been brought up by me, I could at the beginning get more help from them than from the Paris workmen. To this the king replied that I might name a salary which I thought sufficient for their maintenance. I said that 100 crowns of gold apiece would be quite proper, and that I would make them earn their wages well. This agreement was concluded. Then I said that I had found a place which seemed to me exactly suited to my industry. It was his Majesty's own property, and called the Little Nello. The provost of Paris was then in possession of it from his Majesty, but since the provost made no use of the castle, his Majesty perhaps might grant it to me to employ in his service. He replied upon the instant, "That place is my own house, and I know well that the man I gave it to does not inhabit or use it, so you shall have it for the work you have to do." He then told his lieutenant to install me in the Nello. This officer made some resistance, pleading that he could not carry out the order. The king answered in anger that he meant to bestow his property on whom he pleased, and on a man who would serve him, seeing that he got nothing from the other. Therefore he would hear no more about it. The lieutenant then submitted that some small force would have to be employed in order to effect an entrance, to which the king answered, "Go then, and if a small force is not enough, use a great one." The officer took me immediately to the castle. There he put me in possession, if not, however, without violence. After that he warned me to take very good care that I was not murdered. I installed myself, enrolled serving men, and bought a quantity of pikes and partisans. But I remained for several days exposed to grievous annoyances, for the provost was a great nobleman of Paris, and all the other gentlefolk took part against me. They attacked me with such insults that I could hardly hold my own against them. I must not omit to mention that I entered the service of His Majesty in the year 1540, which was exactly the year in which I reached the age of 40. Chapter 13. The affronts and insults I received made me have recourse to the king, begging His Majesty to establish me in some other place. He answered, "Who are you, and what is your name?" I remained in great confusion, and could not comprehend what he meant. Holding my tongue thus, the king repeated the same words a second time angrily. Then I said my name was Benvenuto. "If, then, you are Benvenuto, of whom I have heard," replied the king, "act according to your wont, for you have my full leave to do so." I told His Majesty that all I wanted was to keep his favour. For the rest I knew nothing that could harm me. He gave a little laugh and said, "Go your ways, then. You shall never want my favour." Upon this he told his first secretary, Monsignor de Villeroy, to see me provided and accommodated with all I needed. This Villeroy was an intimate friend of the provost, to whom the castle had been given. It was built in a triangle, right up against the city walls, and was of some antiquity, but had no garrison. The building was of considerable size. Monsignor de Villeroy counselled me to look about for something else, and by all means to leave this place alone, seeing that its owner was a man of vast power, who would most absurdly have me killed. I answered that I had come from Italy to France only in order to serve that illustrious king, and as for dying, I knew for certain that die I must. A little earlier or a little later was the matter of supreme indifference to me. Now Villeroy was a man of the highest talent, exceptionally distinguished in all points, and possessed of vast wealth. There was nothing he would not gladly have done to harm me, but he made no open demonstration of his mind. He was grave and a noble presence, and spoke slowly, at his ease, to another gentleman, Marmagna, the treasurer of Languedoc. He left the duty of molesting me. The first thing which this man was to look out the best apartments in the castle, and to have them fitted up for himself. I told him that the king had given me the place to serve him in, and that I did not choose it should be occupied by any but myself and my attendants. The fellow, who was haughty, bold, and spirited, replied that he meant to do just what he liked, that I should run my head against a wall if I presumed to oppose him, and that Villeroy had given him authority to do what he was doing. I told him that, by the king's authority given to me, neither he nor Villeroy could do it. When I said that, he gave vent to offensive language in French, whereat I retorted in my own tongue that he lied. Stung with rage, he clapped his hand upon a little dagger which he had. Then I set my hand also to a large dirk, which I always wore for my defence, and cried out, "If you dare to draw, I'll kill you on the spot." He had 2 servants to back him, and I had only my 2 lads. For a moment or two Marmagna stood in doubt, not knowing exactly what to do, but rather inclined to mischief, and muttering, "I will never put up with such insults." Seeing then that the affair was taking a bad turn, I took a sudden resolution, and cried to Bagolo and Ascanio, "When you see me draw my dirk, throw yourselves upon those serving men, and kill them if you can. I mean to kill this fellow at the first stroke, and then we will decamp together with God's grace." Marmagna, when he understood my purpose, was glad enough to get alive out of the castle. All these things, toning them down a trifle, I wrote to the Cardinal Ferrara, who related them at once to the king. The king, deeply irritated, committed me to the care of another officer of his bodyguard, who was named Monsignor de Iscantrio de Orbec. By him I was accommodated with all that I required in the most gracious way imaginable. End of Section 3. Recording by Chris Caron. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota, January 2010. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 4, Chapters 14 through 18. Chapter 14. After fitting up my own lodgings in the castle and the workshop with all the conveniences for carrying on my business, and putting my household upon a most respectful footing, I began at once to construct 3 models exactly of the size which the silver statues were to be. There were Jupiter, Vulcan, and Mars. I molded them in clay, and set them well up on irons. Then I went to the king, who disturbed 300 pounds weight of silver, if I remember rightly, for the commencement of the undertaking. While I was getting these things ready, we bought the little vase and oval basin to completion, which had been several months in hand. Then I had them richly gilt, and they showed like the finest piece of plate which had been seen in France. Afterwards I took them to the cardinal, who thanked me greatly, and without requesting my attendance, carried and presented them to the king. He was delighted with the gift, and praised me as no artist was ever praised before. In return he bestowed upon the cardinal an abbey worth 7,000 crowns a year, and expressed his intention of rewarding me too. The cardinal, however, prevented him, telling his Majesty that he was going ahead too fast, since I had as yet produced nothing for him. The king, who was exceedingly generous, replied, "For that very reason will I put heart and hope into him." The cardinal, ashamed at his own meanness, said, "Sire, I beg you to leave that to me. I will allow him a pension of at least 300 crowns, when have taken possession of the abbey." He never gave me anything, and it would be tedious to relate all the knavish tricks of this prelate. I prefer to dwell on matters of greater moment. Chapter 15. When I returned to Paris, the great favor shown to me by the king made me a mark for all men's admiration. I received the silver, and began my statue of Jupiter. Many journeymen were now in my employ, and the work went onward briskly day and night, so that by the time I had finished the clay models of Jupiter, Vulcan, and Mars, and had begun to get the silver statue forward, my workshop made already a grand show. The king now came to Paris, and I went to pay him my respects. No sooner had his Majesty set my eyes upon me than he called me cheerfully, and asked if I had something fine to exhibit at my lodging, for he would come to inspect it. I related all I had been doing, upon which he was seized with a strong desire to come. Accordingly, after this dinner, he set off with Madame de Tampes, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and some other of his greatest nobles, among whom were the King of Navarre, his cousin, and the Queen, his sister. The Dauphin and Dauphiness also attended him, so that upon the day the very flower of the French court came to visit me. I had been some time at home, and was hard at work, when the king arrived at the door of the castle, and heard our hammers going. He bade his company keep silence. Everybody in my house was busily employed, so that the unexpected entrance of his Majesty took me by surprise. The first thing he saw on coming into the great hall was myself with a huge plate of silver in my hand, which I was beating for the body of my Jupiter. One of my men was finishing the head, another the legs, and it is easy to imagine what a din we made between us. It happened that a little French lad was working at my side, who had just been guilty of something trifling blunder. I gave the lad a kick, and as my good luck would have it, caught him with my foot exactly in the fork between his legs, and sent him spinning several yards, so that he came stumbling up against the king precisely at the moment when his Majesty arrived. The king was vastly amused, but I felt covered with confusion. He began to ask me that I was engaged upon, and told me to go on working. Then he said that he would much rather have me not employ my strength on manual labor, but take as many men as I wanted, and make them do the rough work. He should like me to keep myself in health, in order that he might enjoy my services through many years to come. I replied to his Majesty that the moment I left off working I should fall ill, also that my art itself would suffer, and not attain the mark I aimed at for his Majesty, thinking that I spoke thus only to brag, and not because it was the truth. He made the Cardinal of Lorraine repeat what he had said, but I explained my reasons so fully and clearly that the Cardinal perceived my drift. He then advised the King to let me labor as much or little as I liked. Chapter 16. Being very well satisfied with what he had seen, the King returned to his palace, after bestowing on me too many marks of favour to be here recorded. On the following day he sent for me at his dinner hour. The Cardinal of Ferrara was there at meat with him. When I arrived, the King had reached his second course. He began at once to speak to me, saying with a pleasant cheer, that having now so fine a basin and jug of my workmanship, he wanted an equally handsome salt cellar to match them, and begged me to make a design, and to lose no time about it. I replied, "Your Majesty shall see a model of the sort even sooner than you have commanded, for while I was making the basin, I thought there ought to be a salt cellar to match it. Therefore I have already designed one, and if it is your pleasure, I will at once exhibit my conception." The King turned with a lively movement of surprise and pleasure to the lords in his company. They were the King of Navarre, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and the Cardinal of Ferrara, exclaiming as he did so, "Upon my word, this is a man to be loved and cherished by every one who knows him." Then he told me that he would very gladly see my model. I set off, and returned in a few minutes, for I had only to cross the river, that is, the Seine. I carried with me the wax model which I had made in Rome at the Cardinal of Ferrara's request. When I appeared again before the King and uncovered my piece, he cried out in astonishment, "This is 100 times more divine a thing than I had ever dreamed of. What a miracle of a man! He ought never to stop working." Then he turned to me with a beaming countenance, and told me he greatly liked the piece, and wished me to execute it in gold. The Cardinal of Ferrara looked me in the face, and let me understand that he recognized the model as the same which I had made for him in Rome. I replied that I had already told him I should carry it out for one who was worthy of it. The Cardinal, remembering my words, and nettled by the revenge he thought that I was taking on him, remarked to the King, "Sire, this is an enormous undertaking. I am only afraid that we shall never see it finished. These able artists, who have great conceptions in their brain, are ready enough to put the same in execution, without duly considering when they are to be accomplished. I, therefore, if I gave commission for things of such magnitude, should like to know when I was likely to get them." The King replied that if a man was so scrupulous about the termination of a work, he would never begin anything at all. These words he uttered with a certain look, which implied that such enterprises were not for folk of little spirit. I began to say my say. "Princes who put heart and courage in their servants, as your Majesty does by deed and word, render undertakings of the greatest magnitude quite easy. Now that God has sent me so magnificent a patron, I hope to perform for him a multitude of great and splendid masterpieces." "I believe it," said the King, and rose from table. Then he called me into his chamber, and asked me how much gold was wanted for the salt cellar. 1,000 crowns, I answered. He called his treasurer at once, who was the Viscount of Orbec, and ordered him that very day to disburse me 1,000 crowns of good weight in old gold. When I left his Majesty, I went for the 2 notaries who had helped me in procuring silver for the Jupiter, and many other things. Crossing the Seine, I then took a small hand-basket, which one of my cousins, a nun, had given me on my journey through Florence. It made for my good fortune that I took this basket, and not a bag. So then, thinking I could do the business by daylight, for it was still early, and not caring to interrupt my workmen, and being indisposed to take a servant with me, I set off alone. When I reached the house of the treasurer, I found that he had the money laid out before him, and was selecting the best pieces as the King has ordered. It seemed to me, however, that the thief of a treasurer was doing all he could to postpone the payment of the money, nor were the pieces counted out until 3 hours after nightfall. I meanwhile was not wanting in despatch, for I sent word to several of my journeymen that they should come and attend me, since the matter was one of serious importance. When I found that they did not arrive, I asked the messenger if he had done my errand. The rascal of a groom whom I sent replied that he had done so, but that they answered that they could not come. He, however, would gladly carry the money for me. I answered that I meant to carry the money myself. But this time the contract was drawn up and signed. On the money being counted, I put it all into my little basket, and then thrust my arm through the two handles. Since I did this, and some difficulty, the gold was well shut in, and I carried it more conveniently than if the vehicle had been a bag. I was well armed with shirt and sleeves of mail, and having my sword and dagger at my side, made off along the street as quick as my 2 legs would carry me. Chapter 17. Just as I left the house, I observed some servants whispering among themselves, who also went off at a round pace in another direction from the one I took. Walking with all haste, I passed the bridge of the Exchange, and went up along a wall beside the river, which led to my lodging in the castle. I had come to the Augustines. Now this was a very perilous passage, and though it was only 500 paces distant from my dwelling, yet the lodging in the castle being quite as far removed inside, no one could have heard my voice if I had shouted, when I saw 4 men with 4 swords in their hands advancing to attack me. My resolution was taken in an instant. I covered the basket with my cape, drew my sword, and seeing that they were pushing hotly forward, cried aloud, "With soldiers there is only the cape and sword to gain, and these, before I give them up, I hope you'll get not much to your advantage." Then crossing my sword boldly with them, I more than once spread out my arms, in order that, if the ruffians were put on by the servants, who had seen me to take my money, they might be led to judge I was not carrying it. The encounter was soon over, for they retired step by step, carrying along themselves in their own language. This is a brave Italian, and certainly not the man we are after, or if he be the man, he cannot be carrying anything. I spoke Italian, and kept harrying them with thrust and slash so hotly that I narrowly missed killing one of the other. My skill in using the sword made them think I was a soldier, rather than a fellow of some other calling. They drew together, and began to fall back, muttering all the while beneath their breath in their own tongue. I meanwhile continued always calling out, but not too loudly, that those who wanted my cape and blade would have to get them with some trouble. Then I quickened pace, while they still followed slowly at my heels. This augmented my fear, for I thought I might be falling into an ambuscade, which would have cut me off in front as well as rear. Accordingly, when I was at the distance of 100 paces from my home, I ran with all my might, and shouted at the top of my voice, "2 arms, 2 arms, out with you! Out with you! I am being murdered!" In a moment 4 of my young men came running, with 4 pikes in their hands. They wanted to pursue the ruffians, who could still be seen, but I stopped them, calling back, so as to let the villains hear, "Those cowards yonder, 4 against 1 man alone, had not pluck enough to capture 1,000 golden crowns in metal, which have almost broken this arm of mine. Let us haste inside and put the money away. Then I will take my big 2-handed sword, and go with you whithersoever you like." We went inside to secure the gold, and my lads, while expressing the deep concern for the peril I had run, gently chided me, and said, "You risk yourself too much alone. The time will come when you will make us all bemoan your loss." 1,000 words and exclamations were exchanged between us. My adversaries took to flight, and we all sat down and supped together with mirth and gladness, laughing over to those great blows which fortune strikes, for good as well as evil, and which, what time they do not hit the mark, are just the same as though they had not happened. It is very true that one says to oneself, "You will have had a lesson for the next time," but that is not the case, for fortune always comes upon us in new ways, quite unforeseen by our imagination. Chapter 18. On the morning which followed these events, I made the first step in my work upon the great salt cellar, pressing this and my other pieces forward with incessant industry. My workplace at this time, who were pretty numerous, included both sculptors and goldsmiths. They belonged to several nations, Italian, French, and German, for I took the best I could find, and changed them, often retaining only those who knew their business well. These select craftsmen I worked to the bone with perpetual labor. They wanted to rival me, but I had a better constitution. Consequently, in their inability to bear up against such a continuous strain, they looked to eating and drinking copiously, Some of the Germans in particular, who were more skilled than their comrades, and wanted to march apace with me, sank under these excesses and perished. While I was at work upon the Jupiter, I noticed that I had plenty of silver to spare, so I took in hand, without consulting the king, to make a great two-handled vase, about 1 cubit and a half in height. I also conceived the notion of casting the large model of my Jupiter in bronze, having up to this date done nothing of the sort. I conferred with certain old men, experienced in that art of Paris, and described to them the methods in use with us in Italy. They told me they had never gone that way about the business, but that if I gave them leave to act upon their own principles, they would bring the bronze out as clean and perfect as the clay. I chose to strike an agreement, throwing on them the responsibility, and promising several crowns above the price they bargained for. Thereupon they put work in progress, but I soon saw that they were going the wrong way about it, and began on my own account a head of Julius Caesar, bust and armour much larger than the life, which I modelled from a reduced copy of a splendid antique portrait I had brought with me from Rome. I also undertook another head of the same size, studied from a very handsome girl, whom I've kept for my own pleasures. I called this Fontainebleau, after the place selected by the king for his particular delight. We constructed an admirable little furnace for the casting of the bronze, got all things ready, and baked our moulds, those French masters undertaking the Jupiter, while I looked after my 2 heads. Then I said, I do not think you will succeed with your Jupiter, because you have not provided sufficient vents beneath for the air to circulate. Therefore you are but losing your time and trouble. They replied that, if their work proved a failure, they would pay back the money I had given on account, and regroup me for current expenses, but they bade me give good heed to my own proceedings, for the fine heads I meant to cast in my Italian fashion would never succeed. At this dispute between us there were present the treasurers and other gentlefolk, commissioned by the king to superintend my proceedings. Everything which passed by word or act was duly reported to his Majesty. The 2 old men who had undertaken to cast my Jupiter postponed the experiment, saying they would like to arrange the moulds of my 2 heads. They argued that, according to my method, no success could be expected, and it was a pity to waste such fine models. When the king was informed of this, he sent word that they should give their minds to learning, and not try to teach their master. So then they put their now piece into the furnace with much laughter, while I, maintaining a firm carriage, showing neither mirth nor anger, though I felt it, placed my 2 heads, one on each side of the Jupiter. The metal came all right to melting, and we let it in with joy and gladness. It filled the mould of the Jupiter most admirably, and at the same time my 2 heads. This furnished them with matter for rejoicing, and me with satisfaction, for I was not sorry to have predicted wrongly of their work, and they made as though they were delighted to have been mistaken about mine. Then, as the custom in France is, they asked to drink in high good spirits. I was very willing, and ordered a handsome collation for their entertainment. When this was over, they requested me to pay the money due to them and the surplus I had promised. I replied, "You have been laughing over what I fear may make you weep. On reflection, it seems to me that too much metal flowed into your mould. Therefore I shall wait until tomorrow before I disburse more money." The poor fellows swallowed my words and chewed the cud of them. Then they went home without further argument. At daybreak they began quite quietly to break into the pit of the furnace. They could not uncover their large mould until they had extracted my 2 heads. These were in excellent condition, and they placed them where they could be well seen. When they came to Jupiter, had dug but scarcely 2 cubits, they sent up such a yell, they had 4 workmen, that it woke me up. Fancying it was a shout of triumph, I set off running, for my bedroom was at the distance of more than 500 paces. On reaching the spot, I found them looking like the guardians of Christ's sepulchre in a picture, downcast and terrified. Casting a hasty glance upon my 2 heads, and seeing they were all right, I tempered my annoyance with the pleasure that sight gave me. Then they began to make excuses, crying, "Our bad luck!" I retorted, "Your luck has been most excellent, but what has been indeed bad is your deficiency of knowledge. Had I only seen you put the soul into your mold, I could have taught you with the one word how to cast the figure without fault. This would have brought me great honor and you much profit. I shall be able to make good my reputation, but you will now lose both your honor and your profit. Let then this lesson teach you another time to work, and not to poke fun at your masters. End of section 4. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota, as of January 2010. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 5, Chapters 19 through 24. Chapter 19. About this time, the illustrious soldier Piero Strozzi arrived in France, and reminded the king that he had promised him letters of naturalization. These were accordingly made out, and at the same time the king said, "Let them be also given to Benvenuto mon ami, and take them immediately to his house, and let him have them without the payment of any fees." Those of the great Strozzi cost him several hundred ducats. Mine were brought to me by one of the king's chief secretaries, Messer Antonio Masson. This gentleman presented them with many expressions of kindness from his Majesty, saying, "The king makes you a gift of these, in order that you may be encouraged to serve him. They are letters of naturalization." Then he told me how they had been given to Piero Strozzi, at his particular request, and only after a long time of waiting. As a special mark of favor, the king had sent mine of his own accord, and such an act of grace had never been heard of in that realm before. When I heard these words, I thanked his Majesty with heartiness, but I begged the secretary to have the kindness to tell me what letters of naturalization meant. He was a man accomplished and polite, who spoke Italian excellently. At first my question made him laugh. Then he recovered his gravity, and told me in my own language what the papers signified, adding that they conferred one of the highest dignities a foreigner could obtain. Indeed, it is a far greater honor than to be made a nobleman of Venice. When he left me, he returned and told his Majesty, who laughed a while, and then said, "Now I wish him to know my object in sending those letters of naturalization. Go and install him lord of the castle of the Little Nello, where he lives, and which is a part of my demesne. He will know what it means better than he understood about the letters of naturalization." A messenger brought me the patent, upon which I wanted to give him a gratuity. He refused to accept it, saying that his Majesty had so ordered. These letters of naturalization, together with the patent for the castle, I brought with me. Then I returned to Italy. Wherever I go, and wherever I may end my days, I shall endeavor to preserve them. Chapter 20. I shall now proceed with the narration of my life. I had on hand the following works already mentioned, namely, the silver Jupiter, the golden salt cellar, the great silver vase, and the 2 bronze heads. I also began to cast the pedestal for Jupiter, which I wrought very richly in bronze, covered with ornaments, among which was a bas relief representing the rape of Ganymede, and on the other side Leda and the swan. On casting this piece, it came out admirably. I also made another pedestal of the same sort for the statue of Juno, intending to begin that too, if the king gave me silver for that purpose. By working briskly, I had put together the silver Jupiter and the golden salt cellar. The vase was far advanced. The 2 bronze heads were finished. I had also made several little things for the Cardinal of Ferrara, and a small silver vase of rich workmanship, which I meant to present to Madame d'Etampes, several Italian noblemen, to wit, Signor Piero Strozzi, the Count of Anguillara, the Count of Pitigliano, the Count of Mirandola, and many others, gave me employment also. For my great king, as I have said, I had been working strenuously, and the 3rd day after he returned to Paris, he came to my house, attended by a crowd of his chief nobles. He marvelled to find how many pieces I had advanced, and with what excellent results. His mistress, Madame d'Etampes, being with him, they began to talk of Fontainebleau. She told his Majesty he ought to commission me to execute something beautiful for the decoration of his favourite residence. He answered on the instant, You may well, and here upon the spot I will make up my mind what I mean him to do." Then he turned to me, and asked me what I thought would be appropriate for that beautiful fountain. I suggested several ideas, and his Majesty expressed his own opinion. Afterwards he said that he was going to spend 15 or 20 days at San Germano dell'Aia, a place 12 leagues distant from Paris. During his absence he wished me to make a model for that fair fountain of his in the richest style I could invent, seeing he delighted in that residence more than in anything else in his whole realm. Accordingly he commanded and besought me to do my utmost to produce something really beautiful, and I promised that I would do so. When the king saw so many finished things before him, he exclaimed to Madame d'Etampes, "I never had an artist who pleased me more, nor one who deserved better to be well rewarded. We must contrive to keep him with us. He spends freely, is a boon companion, and works hard. We must therefore take good thought for him. Only think, madam, all the times that he has come to me, or that I have come to him. He has never once asked for anything. One can see that his heart is entirely devoted to his work. We ought to make a point of doing something for him quickly, else we run a risk of losing him." Madame d'Etampes answered, "I will be sure to remind you." Then they departed, and in addition to the things I had begun, I now took the model of the fountain in hand, at which I worked assiduously. Chapter 21. At the end of a month and a half the king returned to Paris, and I, who had been working day and night, went to present myself before him, taking my model so well blocked out that my intention could be clearly understood. Just about that time the devilries of war between the emperor and king had been stirred up again, so that I found him much harassed by anxieties. I spoke, however, with the Cardinal of Ferrara, saying I had brought some models which his Majesty had adored, and begging him, if he found an opportunity, to put in a word whereby I might be able to exhibit them. The king, I thought, would take much pleasure in their sight. This the Cardinal did, and no sooner had he spoken of the models than the king came to the place where I had sent them up. The first of these was intended for the door of the palace at Fontainebleau. I had been obliged to make some alterations in the architecture of this door, which was wide and low in their vicious French style. The opening was very nearly square, and above it was a hemicycle, flattened like the handle of a basket. Here the king wanted a figure placed to represent the genius of Fontainebleau. I corrected the proportions of the doorway, and placed above it an exact half-circle at the sides. I introduced projections, with scodes and cornices properly corresponding. Then, instead of the columns demanded by this disposition of parts, I fashioned 2 satyrs, one upon each side. The first of these was in somewhat more than half relief, lifting one hand to support the cornice, and holding a thick club in the other. His face was fiery and menacing, instilling fear into the beholders. The other had the same posture of support, but I varied his features and some other details. In his hand, for instance, he held a lash with 3 balls attached to chains. Though I call them satyrs, they show nothing of the satyr, except little horns and a goatish head. All the rest of their form was human. In the lunette above I placed a female figure lying in an attitude of noble grace. She rested her left arm on a stag's neck, the animal being one of the king's emblems. On one side I worked little fawns in half relief, with some wild boars and other game in lower relief. On the other side were hounds and divers hogs of the chase of several species, such as may be seen in that fair forest where the fountain springs. The whole of this composition was enclosed in an oblong, each angle of which obtained a victory in bas relief, holding torches after the manner of the ancients. Above the oblong was a salamander, the king's particular device, with many other ornaments appropriate to the Ionic architecture of the whole design. Chapter 22. When the king had seen this model, it restored him to cheerfulness, and distracted his mind from the fatiguing debates he had been holding during the past 2 hours. Seeing him cheerful as I wished, I uncovered the other model, which he was far from expecting, since he not unreasonably judged that the first had worked in it enough. This one was a little higher than 2 cubits. It figured a fountain shaped in a perfect square, with handsome steps all round, intersecting each other in a way which was unknown in France, as indeed very uncommon in Italy. The middle of the fountain I set a pedestal projecting somewhat above the margin of the basin, and upon this a nude male figure, of the right proportion to the whole design, and of a very graceful form. In his right hand he raised a broken lance on high. His left hand rested on a scimitar. He was poised upon the left foot, and right being supported by a helmet of the richest imaginable workmanship. At each of the four angles of the fountain a figure was sitting, raised above the level of the base, and accompanied by many beautiful and appropriate emblems. The king began by asking me what I meant to represent by the fine fancy I had embodied in this design, saying that he understood the door without explanation, but that he could not take the conception of my fountain. Although it seemed to him most beautiful at the same time, he knew well that I was not like the foolish folk who turn out something with a kind of grace, but no intention into their performances. I then addressed myself to the task of exposition, for having succeeded in pleasing him with my work, I wanted him to be no less pleased with my discourse. "Let me inform your sacred Majesty," I thus began, "that the whole of this model is so exactly made to scale, that if it should come to being executed in large none of its grace and lightness will be sacrificed. The figure in the middle is meant to stand 54 feet above the level of the ground." At this announcement the king made a sign of purpose. "It is, moreover, intended to represent the god Mars. The other figures embody those arts and sciences in which your Majesty takes pleasure, and which you so generously patronize. This one upon the right hand is designed for learning. You will observe that the accompanying emblems indicate philosophy and her attendant branches of knowledge. By the next I wish to personify the whole art of design, including sculpture, painting, and architecture. The third is music, which cannot be omitted from the sphere of intellectual culture. That other, which so gracious and benign a mien, stands for generosity, lacking which the mental gifts bestowed on us by God will not be brought to view. I have attempted to portray your Majesty, your very self, in the great central statue, for you are truly a god Mars, the only brave upon this globe, and all your bravery you use with justice and with piety in the defence of your own glory." Scarcely had he allowed me to finish this oration, when he broke forth with a strong voice, "Verily, I found a man here after my own heart." Then he called the treasurers who were appointed for my supplies, and told them to disburse whatever I required, let the cost be what it might. Next he laid his hand upon my shoulder, saying, "Mon ami," which is the same as my friend, "I know not whether the pleasure be greater for the prince who finds a man after his own heart, or for the artist who finds a prince willing to furnish him with means for carrying out his great ideas." I answered that, if I was really the man his Majesty described, my good fortune was by far the greater. He answered laughingly, "Let us agree, then, that our luck is equal." Then I departed in the highest spirits, and went back to my work. Chapter 23. My ill luck willed that I was not wide awake enough to play the light comedy with Madame d'Etampes that evening. When she heard the whole course of events from the king's own lips, it bred such poisonous fury in her breast that she exclaimed with anger, "If Benvenuto had shown me those fine things of his, he would have given me some reason to be mindful of him at the proper moment." The king sought to excuse me, but he made no impression on her temper. Being informed of what had passed, I waited 15 days, during which they made a tour through Normandy, visiting Rouen and Dieppe. Then, when they returned to Est, German, and Laie, I took the handsome little vase which I made at the request of Madame d'Etampes, hoping, if I gave it to her, to recover the favour I had lost. With this in my hand, then I announced my presence to her nurse, and showed the gift which I brought her mistress. The woman received me with demonstrations of good will, and said that she would speak a word to Madame, who was still engaged upon her toilette. I should be admitted on the instant, when she had discharged her embassy. The nurse made her report in full to Madame, who retorted scornfully, "Tell him to wait." On hearing this, I clothed myself with patience, which all of things I find the most difficult. Nevertheless, I kept myself under control until the hour for dinner was past. Then, seeing what time dragged on, and being maddened by hunger, I could no longer hold out, but flung off, sending her most devoutly to the devil. I next betook myself to the Cardinal of Lorraine, and made him a present of the vase, only petitioning his Eminence to maintain me in the king's good graces. He said there was no need for this, and if there were need he would gladly speak for me. Then he called his treasurer, and whispered a few words in his ear. The treasurer waited till I took my leave of the cardinal, after which he said to me, "Benvenuto, come with me, and I will give you a glass of good wine to drink." I answered, not understanding what he meant. "For heaven's sake, Mr. Treasurer, let me have but one glass of wine and a mouthful of bread, for I am really fainting for want of food. I have fasted since early this morning, up to the present moment, at the door of Madame d'Etampes. I went to give her that fine piece of silver gilt plate, and took pains that she would be informed of my intention. But she, with the mere pretty will to vex me, bade me wait. Now I am famished, and feel my forces failing, and as God willed it, I have bestowed my gift and labour upon one who is far more worthy of them. I only crave of you something to drink, for being rather too bilious by nature, fast upsets me so that I run the risk now of falling from exhaustion to the earth." While I was pumping out of these words with difficulty, they brought some admirable wine and other delicacies for a hearty meal. I refreshed myself, and having recovered my vital spirits, found that my exasperation had departed from me. The good treasurer handed me 100 crowns in gold. I sturdily refused to accept them. He reported this to the cardinal, who swore at him, and told him to make me take the money by force, and not to show himself again till he had done so. The treasurer returned, much irritated, saying that he had never been so scolded before by the cardinal. But when he pressed the crowns upon me, I still offered some resistance. Then, quite angry, he said he would use force to make me take them. So I accepted the money. When I wanted to thank the cardinal in person, he sent word by one of his secretaries that he would gladly do me a service whenever the occasion offered. I returned the same evening to Paris. The king heard the whole history, and Madame d'Etampes was well laughed at in their company. This increased her animosity against me, and led to an attack upon my life, of which I shall speak in the proper time and place. Chapter 24. Far back in my autobiography I ought to have recorded the friendship which I won with the most cultivated, the most affectionate, and the most companionable man of worth I ever knew in this world. He was Messer Guido Guidi, an able physician and doctor of medicine, and a nobleman of Florence. The infinite troubles brought upon me by my evil fortune caused me to omit the mention of him at an earlier date, and though my remembrance may be but a trifle, I deemed it sufficient to keep him always in my heart. Yet, finding that the drama of my life requires his presence, I shall introduce him here at the moment of my greatest trials, in order that, as he was when my comfort and support, I may now recall to memory the good he did me. Well, then, Mr. Guido came to Paris, and not long after making his acquaintance, I took him to my castle, and there he assigned him his own suite of apartments. We enjoyed our lives together in that place for several years. The Bishop of Pavia, that is to say, Monsignor de Rossi, brother of the Count of San Secondo, also arrived. This gentleman I removed from his hotel, and took him to my castle, assigning him in like manner of his own suite of apartments, where he sojourned many months with serving men and horses. On another occasion I lodged Messer Luigi Alamanni and his sons for some months. It was indeed God's grace to me that I should thus, in my poor station, be able to render services to men of great position and acquirements. But to return to Messer Guido, we enjoyed our mutual friendship during all the years I stayed in Paris, and often did we exult together on being able to advance in art and knowledge at the cost of that so great and admirable prince, our patron, each in his own branch of industry. I can indeed, and with good conscience, affirm that all I am, whatever of good and beautiful I have produced, all this must be ascribed to that extraordinary monarch. So then I will resume the thread of my discourse concerning him, and the great things I wrought for him. End of Section 5. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota.